Well, g'day everyone. How's it going? This is my 5 tips and tricks for the Canon R7. I recently picked up this camera and yeah, I just wanted to take you through some of the things that I've learned in just using this camera and having it in the hand now for a number of weeks. And so yeah, let's get right into it. Well, the first thing I'll say is that this shoots in Canon Log 3. So you should definitely utilize that feature. What it does is it takes your footage from just a normal standard profile and it puts it into like a Canon log profile, gives you more dynamic range and also gives you a higher bit rate as well. Now, this camera doesn't have all eye, but that's actually not a bad thing because the file sizes are quite manageable. And even when you shoot 4K IPB, it actually does really nicely and looks really good. It's actually 170 megabits per second, which is more than enough. So the settings I would go with for that is turn the camera on here and jump into the menu, right across to menu number 3 and Canon log settings, jump in there, C-Log on, view assist. I've gotten used to shooting without view assist, so I have that off, but you can have it on if you want to have a bit more of a look applied to the actual image on the back of the camera. Characteristics, I leave it 000. I sharpen later in post, but you can add sharpening there if you don't want to do it in post, because remember in post it does slow down your computer system somewhat. And then the color space is cinema gamut because this matches up with other Cineline cameras, and also my workflow is now based solely on cinema gamut. So that's kind of how I set it up. And like I said, it gives you the functionality of being able to shoot in a IPB format, which gives you 1 hour and 35 minutes. This is a 256 gigabyte card. So around about 2 hours on a 256 gigabyte card, which is great. And yeah, if you go 4K, it's the same. So the 4K fine is a 7K, which is the full sensor downsampled to 4K. And it's a beautiful looking image. Actually, here's a side-by-side with my Canon R5. And honestly, I can barely tell the difference. Maybe there's a little bit of boost in the R5 in sharpness and detail in the shadows, but otherwise the R7 packs a whole lot of punch. So that's great. The second thing I would do straight away is I would turn the manual focus function to the rotation of the actual lens. So this comes standard with a fly-by-wire kind of setup where it's really hard to actually get focus with that because every time you go, it kind of goes with the speed of what you're going and it will just miss and pass focus. So we have to come across to the AF menu, which is autofocus, and all the way to menu number 6, then down to RF lens MF focus ring sensitivity. It's a mouthful. Basically there, we want to change this to linked to rotation degree. We don't want to do varies with rotation speed because then if you speed up, it will go further, it will focus, look for focus further. If you come away quickly, it will pull back quickly and you kind of not knowing where it is. I always want to link it to rotation degree because that means that basically where I stop and where I end up, I can sort of figure out where I am and it's always going to be consistent in that place. So if I'm doing a bit of a shoot where I'm manually focusing in and out on certain things, then I know, okay, here's where my focus is and then here's where it is. Like if I'm focusing on a near subject, here's where it is, and a subject far away, there's where it is. And I can pick that spot really easily and get the manual focus working really well. That's a setting that I change and I never do it and never use it the other way. It won't affect the autofocus, only the manual focus. So that's a really good one. The third tip that I have is the same thing with autofocus. Stop the lens from focus hunting. So basically, if you have a subject in an interview situation and they step out of the frame of camera, it will continually hunt for another face, even if that face is not there. I think it's a bit silly. It shouldn't really do this, but obviously it searches to find, it's doing its best, but when it can't find something, it just keeps on searching. So it's annoying on set when the subject moves out of frame and you just hear this lens going back and forth. So, you always got to come over then and turn the camera off or whatever. But if you just set this setting, then when they move out of frame, it won't keep searching until there's something that comes back into frame. So it's lens drive when AF impossible. So the autofocus menu item 3. So you want to change stop focus search to on. And that means that when autofocus, it can't find any subject, it will just stop from looking. And then as soon as a subject enters back in and you pick up that subject again with the little AF tracking box, then it will continue to focus. The fourth thing that I do is I don't really like to have the record button on the shutter button because I'm also a photographer, and so I like to keep this for autofocus and then a full press for photography. So I do utilize the record button on top of the camera, but sometimes depending on the way I'm shooting, it's not in the right spot. And more so on the R7 than on the R5. I'm quite used to the R5, but the R7 seems to be a little more clunky. Maybe it's because this section's a little smaller, a little more compact. So what I actually do is I map it to the AF on button for video only. So obviously I use the AF on button, which is this one here. I use that during photography, but not during video. So I don't necessarily want to turn it on and off from there. And I can turn it on and off from the screen, from the touch screen anyway, if I want to. So I'm not utilizing it. So I actually make this the record button. So the way that you do that is you got to go into custom controls, which is in the orange menu, the second from the end. And you come down to custom buttons or customize buttons. And you want to go across to the video side. And basically you see the AF on button there. And I've already set that, but basically you've got all these options for AF on and, AF metering start, or you could have AF on or off, that kind of thing as a toggle. I just come down and I hit this one here, which is movie recording. I select that. So now when I want to record, I can just hit that button where my thumb is, and it's just in a nice position there, and I can work on, that can be my record button. So I set that up, as soon as I get a camera, any real Canon mirrorless cameras I use that with now. So I'm not having to do this weird kind of, press on the record button there. And, sometimes you can miss it. Sometimes you can hit the wrong one, and just having it there positive where your thumb is, even holding one hand, you can still just press it. It's just in the right spot, I think, to have that as a record button. So that's what I do. So tip number 5 is, because this camera is a little noisier because of the sensor size in the ISO settings, I want to restrict the camera to only ever go up to 800 ISO. So in the menu settings, I set that so that I never kind of go beyond that. Now I have a control ring sometimes on this camera as well. Right now I've got the focal reducer from Viltrox. You can get a focal reducer for this camera from Canon or Metabones as well, I think, make one for it. But basically that changes the crop of this from 1.6 to like a 1.1. So it's actually quite good to have the focal reducer because it feels more like a full frame camera really, but you're still gonna have those limitations around the ISO and the noise. So anything above sort of 1600 ISO, I would avoid on this camera. But basically what I do is I set it so that it doesn't ever go beyond 800 ISO. So what I wanna do for that is I wanna come to the ISO speed settings here, and I wanna change my ISO to 800 is the one that I want set at. And my ISO speed range, I want to go to the top here, and I want to limit this to 800 as well. Now, look, if you're doing some stuff in low light and you want to go up to 1600, you can do that, but I'm trying to get ideal conditions and ideal shoot settings. Certainly for the shoot that I was on, I used these settings because this worked really well for me. So 800 ISO, and max for auto, I would also go 6400 max for auto, 800, max for auto in video. So you can actually, dial it lower for max for auto in video. Now, I don't often shoot auto ISO anyway, so that's not really relevant for me. But if you are shooting in any of the auto modes, then that's what you need to do. So basically now when I go to the ISO, it restricts and locks me out. So I can go up to 800 or down to 100, and that's it. I can't go any higher than 800. So that's going to avoid me from shooting in an ISO that's too high and that introduces too much noise. As a bonus tip, I didn't mention this, but if you've got the camera, you know it already. So this is kind of tips and tricks for those that already may have the camera. But basically, I would say you set up your C1, C2, and C3. And what I do is I set up C1 as my normal 25 frames per second shooting mode. Then I set up C2 as my high frame rate, or 50 or 60 frames per second shooting mode. And then if there's 100 frames per second mode, which on this there is in 1080p, which is actually quite decent as well when upscaled. So then I set my C3 as my 100 frames per second shooting mode. All you need to do with that is you set the camera settings that you want. So dial them in, and then you click menu, go across to the yellow menu 6, and choose custom shooting modes, and register setting. So register that to C1, click OK, That will register to C1. So now I know my shot settings on C1 are always going to be my 25 frames per second with a 50 shutter and 800 ISO. That's my settings for C1, and everything else with the C-Log and all of that is locked in as well. So now what I want to do is register C2 as my high frame rate mode that I want to shoot in, maybe 50 frames per second for B-roll or overlay footage. So I just click menu again. I go and change that setting for the movie record. I want to do 4K in 50 frames and IPB as well. So make that change. And the other thing I want to do is I just want to boost the shutter speed up to 100. So just make that 100. Still in C-Log 3, everything else is the same. Still got 800 ISO. And so now what I want to do is register that setting as my high frame rate setting. So again, yellow menu 6 and register setting for C2. There you go. Now I might want to do a super slow mo, which on this camera does well. It's only 1920 by 1080, so full HD, but it actually looks quite decent upscaled as well. So back to the menu, back to my high frame rate mode on. So enable that. So now I'm 100 frames a second IPB. That's great. And I also want to just change my shutter to be double that as well. So shutter to 200 and my ISO can stay at 800. Maybe I could boost the ISO on this to 1600 depending on what lighting I have available, or I could drop my f-stop down a little bit as well. So with the focal reducer, I've got an f-stop of 2 with this lens, which is the 24 f2.8. EF lens, and that coupled with the focal reducer gives me the lowest aperture of f2. So that's a nice addition there, but maybe I just drop that down to 2 and then I have enough light for any scenario. So I'm going to register this setting now. So back again, same again as before, menu number 6 on the yellow menu and register setting as setting number 3 and click OK. So now when I dial between my C1, I've got my 25 frames per second. My C2 is my 50 frames a second at 100 shutter, everything else equal. And then when I flick to my C3, it's my high frame rate full HD mode. So there you have it, 5 tips and tricks and a bonus one for the Canon R7. And look, if you've got any questions about the camera or even using it in photo or video mode, comment below and I'd love to get back to you and know how I can help you to, just get the most out of this camera. Well, thanks so much for watching. And if you got value, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe down below. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.